The glass of the Sterling Global Tower in downtown Boston was designed to be impenetrable, a shimmering obsidian skin that reflected the clouds but revealed nothing of the machinations within. Eleanor Sterling, Ella to the few who dared use her name, and Miss Sterling to the hundreds who feared her, stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 44th floor, watching the city pulse. Below, it was 1:45 p.m. on an unseasonably crisp Friday. In 15 minutes, she would walk away from a stack of acquisition contracts that would have made most people's careers, simply because the air in the city had begun to feel like poison. Her father, Arthur Sterling, had been dead for nearly a year, yet his shadow remained the most permanent fixture in the building. He had left her everything: the empire, the assets, the enemies, and a cryptic deed to a property in the northern reaches of Vermont, a place called Oakhaven. She grabbed her coat, a tailored charcoal wool piece that cost more than most mid-sized sedans, and took the private elevator to the basement. Her vehicle of choice was a custom-spec Range Rover, silver black and smelling of expensive leather and silence. She didn't call her driver. Today, she needed to hold the wheel herself. The drive north was a transition from the frantic, gray geometry of Massachusetts to the rolling, aggressive greens of Vermont. As the hours passed, the highway narrowed into state routes, and the state routes bled into winding county roads where the trees leaned in close, as if whispering secrets about the soil. Ella found herself thinking about the upcoming board meeting. Marcus Vane, her father's longtime protege and the company's current managing director, was pushing for a merger that Ella's gut told her was a trap. Marcus was smooth, efficient, and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes, a trait her father had prized but Ella found increasingly predatory. By the time she reached the outskirts of Oakhaven, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. The road was dry, the sky a bruised purple. She was traveling at 50 miles per hour when the world came apart. It started with a sound, a sharp, metallic snap that vibrated through the floorboards. Then, the steering wheel, which a second ago had been light under her fingertips, jerked violently to the right. It wasn't a drift, it was an execution. Ella gasped, her boots finding the brake pedal, but the resistance was gone. The pedal hit the floor with a hollow thud. No, 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 she hissed, her knuckles white as she fought the wheel. The Range Rover drifted out of its lane, the tires screaming against the grid of the shoulder. Ahead, parked partially on the grass beside a cluster of ancient maples, sat an old Ford truck. It was a relic of a different era, painted a faded moss green, its bed filled with weathered timber. The impact was heavy and discordant, the sound of high-end German engineering crumpling against American steel echoed through the valley. Airbags deployed, with a muffled explosion, filling the cabin with white dust and the acrid scent of chemicals. For a long minute, there was only the ticking of cooling metal and the frantic rhythm of Ella's heart. She pushed the deflated airbag aside, her vision swimming. She wasn't injured, save for the immediate, throbbing bruise forming on her shoulder from the seatbelt. Anger, sharp and cold, replaced the shock. She forced the door open, the hinges groaning, and stepped out into the biting Vermont air. "You can't park here," she called out, her voice trembling with a mix of adrenaline and habit. She straightened her coat, trying to reclaim the persona of the Sterling heiress. "This is a blind shoulder." The man sitting on the tailgate of the moss green truck didn't move. He was dressed in a faded flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms mapped with scars and with dust. His boots were scuffed, heavy-duty things that had seen years of hard labor. He looked to be in his late 30s, with a jawline like a cliff edge and eyes the color of a winter lake. He wasn't looking at the damage to his truck. He wasn't looking at her shattered headlight or the steam rising from her hood. He was looking at a thick, cream-colored envelope in his hands. "I said, you need to move this vehicle." Ella stepped closer, her heels clicking on the pavement. "I'll have my insurance contact you, but this is a massive liability." The man finally looked up. His gaze was disconcertingly steady. "The brakes went," he said. It wasn't a question. Ella froze. It was a mechanical failure. A freak occurrence. The steering, too, the man added, his voice a low, melodic rumble. You didn't turn into me. The car took you here. How could you possibly know that? Before he could answer, the low wail of a siren drifted through the trees. A single county cruiser pulled up 5 minutes later, its lights spinning lazily, casting red and blue fractals over the moss-green paint of the truck. An officer stepped out, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a badge that looked like it had been polished every morning for 30 years. He didn't approach Ella first. He walked straight to the man on the truck. Rough Friday, Caleb? The officer asked. Could be worse, Miller. The man, Caleb, replied. Ella stood by her ruined vehicle, feeling the sudden, sharp sting of being in. Outsider. Officer, I'm Eleanor Sterling. My car suffered a catastrophic steering and braking failure. I intend to have it towed to a specialist. Immediately. I'll provide all necessary documentation for the owner of this truck. Officer Miller looked at her, then back at the Range Rover. He didn't seem impressed by the name Sterling. Mechanical failure on a brand new Rover? That's a tall tale, Mississippi. But we'll get the report filed. Caleb, you okay? I'm fine, Caleb said. He stood up, and Ella realized just how large he was. He wasn't just tall. He had the presence of something deeply rooted in the earth. The lady's phone is dead, and the tow from Burlington is going to be at least 2 hours. Dispatch says they're backed up with a multi-car pileup on the I-89. Ella reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. The screen was black. The cold or the impact had finished off the battery. She looked around the desolate stretch of road. The silence of the woods felt heavy, almost predatory. There's a place up the road, Caleb said, gesturing with the envelope. The Silver Whistle. It's warm. They have a landline. Ella looked at him, then at the envelope. For a split second, the wind caught the flap of the paper, and she saw handwriting, sharp, slanted, and painfully familiar. It was her father's script. She felt a phantom chill climb her spine, far colder than the Vermont wind. Fine, she said, her voice stiff. Lead the way. The Silver Whistle was a small, wood-shingled coffee house that smelled of cinnamon, roasted beans, and old books. An older woman with silver-streaked hair stood behind the counter, her eyes widening slightly as Caleb walked in with a disheveled, high-fashion woman in tow. Caleb? What happened to the Ford? The woman asked. Meta Bentley's cousin, Caleb said, sitting at a corner table. He didn't offer to pull out a chair for Ella. Ella sat across from him, her hands trembling. She hid them beneath the table. Let's talk numbers, she began, her corporate instincts kicking in. The truck is an older model. I can offer you a cash settlement today that would triple its blue book value. We can bypass the insurance companies entirely. Caleb watched her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the way she held herself, like a soldier expecting a blow. $700 for the bumper, he said quietly. $400 for the paint match. If the impact jarred the transmission casing, we're looking at another $2,000. Not a penny more. Ella blinked. I'm offering you $10,000 to walk away. I don't want $10,000, Caleb said. I want the truck I've had since I was 18 to work the way it did this morning. The precision of his numbers struck her. This wasn't the talk of a simple woodsman. This was the language of someone who understood contracts, labor, and margins. What do you do, Caleb? She asked, her voice losing some of its edge. I build furniture, he said. Before she could press him, the bell above the door chimed. A small girl, no? More than 6 or 7, came running in. She wore a denim jacket and clutched a folder filled with pressed maple leaves. She headed straight for Caleb, tucking herself behind his sturdy frame as she eyed Ella with cautious curiosity. This is my daughter, Maisie, Caleb said. He didn't provide a last name. Ella, who had spent her life in boardrooms and galas where children were seen, but never heard, nodded awkwardly. Hello. The girl didn't speak. She just watched Ella with the same piercing, lake-colored eyes as her father. Ella's gaze drifted back to the table. The envelope was sitting there, between them. Now that they were under the warm glow of the coffee house lamps, the words on the corner were unmistakable. For Ella, when ready, her breath hitched. That envelope, she whispered, pointing a gloved finger. That's my father's handwriting. Arthur Sterling. How do you have that? Caleb's expression didn't change, but his hand moved, sliding the envelope toward the pocket of his flannel shirt. The crash wasn't an accident, Eleanor. What are you talking about? It was a mechanical failure. A Range Rover doesn't lose its steering and its brakes at the exact same moment. Because of a freak occurrence, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper so Maisie wouldn't hear. The car was told to fail, and it was told to do it on this road. Ella felt the world tilt. You're insane. Who are you? I'm the man who held your father's last secret, Caleb said. He stood up, Maisie gripping his hand. And you're not ready to hear it yet. Wait. Ella rose, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't just leave. My father is dead. If you have something of his. I told you, Caleb said, pausing at the door. You aren't ready. You still think money is the only way to settle a debt. You still think you're safe. Because you have a name. He looked at the black and gold business card Ella had instinctively placed on the table. He didn't touch it. I won't call that number, he said. But Oakhaven is a small town, Miss Sterling. If you want to know what happened to Arthur, you'll find your way to the workshop at the end of the gravel drive. Just don't bring the city with you. He walked out into the gathering dark, leaving Ella standing in the middle of the coffee house. The silver-haired woman behind the counter sighed, pouring a fresh cup of tea and sliding it toward Ella. Drink that, dear, she said kindly. You look like you've seen a ghost. I think I have, Ella whispered, staring at the empty doorway. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the oaks. The mechanical failure, the man with her father's letter, the strange precision of the crash, it was all a tapestry, and the first thread had just been pulled. Ella looked at her hands. They were no longer shaking. A cold, familiar resolve was setting in. She wasn't going back to Boston tomorrow. She was going to find out why Caleb Thorne was waiting for her on a deserted road in Vermont, and why her father had trusted a furniture maker with the truth more than he had trusted his own daughter. The game had begun, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Sterling didn't know the rules. The Oakhaven Arms was not a hotel in the sense that Eleanor Sterling understood the word. There was no concierge, no keyless entry, and certainly no high-speed fiber optic connection. It was a 4-room clapboard structure on Main Street that smelled of lemon wax and centuries of wood smoke. The floorboards groaned under her charcoal-colored boots like they were complaining about the weight of her secrets. Ella sat by the window of room 2, watching the mist settle over the Blackwater River. Her phone, now charging via a sluggish travel cable she'd found in the bottom of her handbag, buzzed with the frantic energy of a world she had momentarily escaped. Marcus Vane had called 6 times. Her head of security had called 4. The board of directors at Sterling Global was likely already spinning a narrative about her impromptu retreat. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened a secure line to a private investigator she had kept on a personal retainer for years, a man named Elias who lived in the shadows of the dark web and took payment in untraceable currency. I need an independent inspector, Ella said, her voice low in the quiet room. I have a Range Rover currently sitting in a lot in Oakhaven, Vermont. I don't want the dealership to touch it. I don't want the insurance adjusters near it. I want someone who can find a needle in a haystack and tell me why the thread was cut. You suspect tampering? Elias's voice was a gravelly rasp. Furniture maker in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't a whim. It was a contingency. Light of the workshop, he looked different. There was a sharp, intellectual light in his eyes that he hadn't allowed her to see at the crash site. Vance and Whitlock, known as the architect for his ability to structure impossible deals, disappeared from public life in 2017. She sat down on one of the white oak chairs, the wood cool against her palms. You were his lawyer. His real lawyer. Not the ones at the tower. I was the one he trusted when the law wasn't enough, Caleb said. He reached into the pocket of his apron and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. He laid it on the workbench between them. He didn't push it toward her. He asked me to give this to you when you were ready, not when you came looking for it. There is a difference. I'm here now, Ella said, her voice rising. I've survived a crash that should have killed me. I'm being hunted by my own board of directors. Am I ready now? Caleb looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. His gaze seemed to strip away Her expensive coat, her corporate armor, and her family name. No, he said. Softly. You're not. Who are you to decide that? Ella stood up, her fury finally breaking through. You're a man who walked away. You left my father alone with Marcus Vane. You hid in the woods while I had to learn how to lead a company that was rotting from the inside. You don't get to judge my readiness. I decide, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level, because you still walked in here thinking you could buy my cooperation. You still think the truth is something that can be negotiated, until you realize that this letter isn't about your inheritance, but about your survival. You aren't ready. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ella wanted to scream, to grab the letter and run, but she knew she couldn't outmaneuver this man. He had been trained by her father. He was a version of Arthur Sterling that hadn't been broken yet. She turned toward the door, her hand on the handle. You should know one thing, she said, her back to him. The car yesterday didn't fail on its own. I haven't. Independent inspector looking at it now. The steering fluid was drained, and the brake line was loosened by hand. She heard the sound of Caleb's hand stopping mid-motion on the workbench. The silence shifted from tense to clinical. Then you're in more danger than I thought, Caleb said. Ella didn't reply. She walked out into the cold, gray morning, the sound of her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. Back at the Oakhaven Arms, she waited. An hour later, her phone rang. It was Marcus Vane. Ella, darling. Marcus's voice was like silk sliding over a blade. We've been worried sick. The driver said you never arrived at the Vermont property. Where are you? Ella took a breath, smoothing her voice into the professional mask she had worn. For years, the car had some trouble, Marcus. I'm staying at a local inn while it gets looked at. Nothing to worry about. A local inn? In that weather? Why not have us send a helicopter? We can have you back in Boston for the evening briefing. I need the air, Ella said. I'll be back on Monday. Of course, Marcus said, pausing for just a beat too long. By the way, I heard about the inspection. It's a bit excessive, don't you think? Bringing in an outside team for a simple mechanical fluke. It makes the company look paranoid. Ella felt a cold drop of sweat trickle down her spine. How did you know about the inspection, Marcus? I haven't filed the report yet. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I'm the managing director, Ella, Marcus said, his voice losing its warmth. I know everything that happens within Sterling Global, even the things you try to keep off the books. Come home. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Ella ended the call without saying goodbye. She stared at the phone, a realization dawning on her that made the room feel like it was closing in. Marcus wasn't just watching the company. He was watching her. He had known about the inspection because he was likely the one who had ordered the sabotage, and he was monitoring her communications to see if she had figured it out. The car crash hadn't been a warning. It had been an assassination attempt. And the only reason she was still breathing was because a moss green Ford truck had been in the way. She stood up and grabbed her keys. She didn't head for the main road. She headed back to the gravel drive. When she reached the barn, Caleb was sitting on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands. Maisie was at his feet, drawing a picture of a fox in the dirt with a stick. They looked like a picture of peace, a stark contrast to the storm Ella was bringing with her. He knows, Ella said, stepping out of the car. Marcus knows I'm looking at the car. He knows I'm here. Caleb stood up, his face hardening. He looked at Maisie. Sweetheart, go inside and check on the wood stove. I'll be there in a minute. The girl nodded and disappeared into the barn. Caleb turned back to Ella. If he knows you're here, then Oakhaven isn't a sanctuary anymore. It's a cage. Then give me the letter, Ella pleaded. If I'm going to die for whatever is in there, I at least want to know why. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and touched the corner of the cream-colored envelope. Your father didn't give me this to protect his legacy, Caleb said. He gave it to me to protect you. But he also knew that if Marcus ever found out it existed, he would burn the world down to get it. Caleb stepped off the porch, walking toward her until he was close enough that she could smell the wood smoke on his clothes. The letter isn't just words, Eleanor. It's a map. And the first stop is a place you've forgotten. Where? The Valeri's project, Caleb said. The place where my wife died. And the place where your father lost his soul. Ella felt a name click into place in her mind. A project her father had buried a decade ago. A project that had been wiped from the Sterling global servers. Stay here tonight, Caleb said, his voice no longer that of a lawyer, but of a man who had seen too many people lose their way. Upstairs in the loft. It's the only place in this valley that Marcus Vane can't see. Ella looked at the barn, then at the dark woods surrounding them. She realized she was no longer the CEO of a billion-dollar empire. She was a woman in a flannel-scented barn, clinging to the only person who knew the truth. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a deep, unforgiving shadow, the counselor's burden had finally become her own. And in the silence of the Vermont night, the ghost of Arthur Sterling seemed to whisper from the trees, telling her that the cost of the truth was always paid in blood. The loft above Caleb Thorne's workshop was a sanctuary of cedar and silence. Eleanor Sterling lay awake on a narrow bed, the quilt smelling of lavender and the high, sharp scent of pine. Below, she could hear the rhythmic, distant ticking of a wood stove cooling and the occasional low groan of the barn's timber settling into the frost. In Boston, the night was never silent. It was a hum of electricity, sirens, and the restless energy of millions. Here, the silence had a weight to it, a physical presence that forced her to confront the thoughts she usually drowned in spreadsheets and scotch. Her father had been a titan. To the world, Arthur Sterling was a man of unshakable iron, a visionary who had built Sterling Global from a boutique investment firm into a planetary force. But as Ella stared at the dark rafters, she remembered the man who used to peel apples in a single, perfect spiral for her when she was 6. She remembered the way his hands had started to shake in the last months of his life, not from age, he was only 65, but from something else, something he was carrying. Marcus Vane had been there through all of it. He was the golden boy, the protege, who stepped in when Arthur's energy began to flag. Now, Ella realized with a jolt of cold terror, Marcus hadn't been helping her father lead. He had been circling him like a shark, waiting for the blood in the water. At dawn, the light filtered through the loft's circular window in dusty, gray shafts. Ella dressed in the same charcoal wool coat, though it felt absurdly formal for the setting. When she descended the ladder, Caleb was already at his workbench. He was fitting a dovetail joint with surgical precision, his movements hypnotic. Maisie was at the small kitchen table in the corner, eating a bowl of oatmeal and carefully coloring a picture of a mountain range. We're going, Caleb said. He didn't look up, but he set his chisel down. Maisie, Iris is coming over in 10 minutes. You stay with her today. Is the Sterling lady coming back? Maisie asked, her eyes darting to Ella. Caleb paused. He looked at Ella, his gaze searching. I think so, he said. Quietly. They drove west in the moss-green Ford. The interior of the truck was as meticulous as the workshop. No clutter, just the smell of old leather and a faint hint of wood shavings. Caleb drove with a steady hand, navigating the winding mountain passes of Vermont before crossing the state line into Massachusetts. The silence between them lasted for 2 hours. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers, but the heavy, charged quiet of two people moving toward a funeral. As they descended from the hills into the industrial corridor along the river, the landscape changed. The lush greens of the valley gave way to rusted warehouses, cracked asphalt, and the skeletal remains of factories that had long since surrendered to time. Caleb turned off onto a county road that had been forgotten by the DOT. He pulled the truck over in front of a massive, rusted chain-link fence. Behind the fence lay a graveyard of ambition. The Valeri's project, Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. Ella stepped out of the truck. The wind here felt different, colder, sharper, carrying the scent of damp concrete and old iron. The site was an empty lot, spanning several acres. In the center stood the foundations of 3 massive buildings, gray concrete weathered to a dark, sickly charcoal, threaded with rebar that had bled orange rust down the sides. Yellow safety tape, bleached white by years of sun and rain, hung in tattered ribbons from the fence. It was meant to be a geothermal energy complex, Caleb said, walking toward the gate. He produced a pair of heavy wire cutters from the truck bed and made a clean snip through the rusted chain. Arthur's legacy. He wanted to pivot the company away from fossil fuels. It was his obsession. He called it the clean heart of Sterling Global. They walked through the tall, dead grass. Ella followed Caleb to a spot near the center of the largest foundation. Caleb stopped and stood perfectly still. He didn't speak for a long time. His shoulders, usually so broad and steady, seemed to sag. My wife, Cora, was the architect of record, Caleb said. He wasn't looking at Ella. He was looking at a patch of cracked concrete. She was brilliant. She didn't just design buildings. She designed ecosystems. She loved this project because it meant something. Ella looked at the ruins. What happened? Volaris Construction was the subcontractor for the site work. Caleb began, his voice taking on the clinical tone of a lead attorney. During the third month of construction, Cora filed an internal report. She had found a critical flaw in the scaffolding and the primary load-bearing supports. The steel was substandard, sourced through a shell company to save costs. It was a death trap. He turned to Ella, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. She sent that report to your father, but Arthur never saw it. Marcus Vane intercepted it. At the time, Sterling Global was 48 hours away from a major IPO. If the Volaris project was delayed for a structural overhaul, the stock would have tanked by an estimated 18%. Billions of dollars would have vanished. Before the opening bell, Ella felt a sick thud in her chest. Marcus suppressed the report. He did more than suppress it, Caleb said. He threatened the site supervisors. He told them the project moved forward or they were out. 2 weeks later, the scaffolding gave way. Cora was on site for a structural review that morning. She was standing right where you are now when 10 tons of steel and wet concrete came down. Ella gasped, taking a step back. The ground beneath her feet suddenly felt like it was made of glass. 2 laborers were killed alongside her, Caleb continued. Another was paralyzed from the waist down. Arthur learned the truth a month later. He was devastated. He wanted to go to the authorities, to confess everything. But Marcus convinced him otherwise. Marcus told him that if the truth came out, the company would collapse, thousands would lose their jobs, and you, his only child, would inherit nothing but a name synonymous with corporate murder. He stayed quiet to protect me, Ella whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He paid for my silence, too, Caleb said, his voice cracking. Though he didn't know Cora was my wife. I had kept my personal life entirely separate from the firm. When Arthur found out, when he saw me at the funeral, he broke. He retired me with a massive settlement, scrubbed my name from the firm, and we made a pact. I would take Maisie and disappear. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make it right in secret. Caleb reached into his coat and finally, slowly, handed the cream-colored envelope to Ella. He wrote this 2 weeks before he died. He told me he couldn't live with the weight anymore. He was going to turn Marcus in. He was going to accept the prison sentence, the disgrace, all of it, just to be able to look you in the eye. Again, Ella took the envelope. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it. The heart attack, she said, her voice trembling. The Monday he died, that was the day he was supposed to meet the federal prosecutors. Caleb nodded. I don't believe his heart just gave out, Eleanor. And after what happened to your car, I think you don't believe it either. Ella sank down into the long, dead grass. She didn't care about her expensive coat or the dirt. She felt a tectonic shift in her world. Everything she thought she knew about her father, her life, and her empire was a lie built on the silence of a dead architect. He loved me, she sobbed, pressing the envelope to her chest. He did all of this to protect me. He did, Caleb said, sitting on the ground beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a grounding force in the storm. But he also knew you were stronger than he was. He knew that one day, you would be the one to finish what he started. For an hour, they sat in the ruins of the Volaris project. Ella cried for the father she had lost, for the woman she had never met, and for the innocence she could never reclaim. When she finally looked up, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the concrete. "What's in the letter, Caleb?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Evidence," Caleb said. "Names. Dates. The original report Cora wrote, which he managed to recover from Marcus's private server. It's everything you need to destroy Marcus Vane." They drove back to Oakhaven in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Now, it was the quiet of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. When they arrived at the barn, Marjorie was there with a pot of tea and a look of deep concern. She had been a friend of Cora's, another piece of the puzzle Caleb had kept hidden. Inside the warm kitchen, Ella sat at the table and finally broke the seal on the envelope. Inside were 4 pages of her father's elegant, slanted handwriting. "My dearest Ella," the letter began. "If you are reading this, I have failed to be the man I wanted you to see. I have traded the truth for your comfort, and in doing so, I have poisoned the very air you breathe." Ella read every word, her eyes stinging. The letter detailed Marcus's rise, the suppression of the Valeri's report, and the systematic way Marcus had taken control of the board. But at the end, there was a list. 11 names. The silent 11. The men and women within Sterling Global who knew the truth and had been paid to keep it. Marcus Vane was number 6. The back door opened, and Marjorie stepped in, carrying a small wooden box. "Caleb, I think it's time," she said softly. She set the box on the table. Inside was a small, black USB drive and a note in a delicate, feminine hand. "Original structural report. I made a copy before submission, just in case." "Cora," Caleb whispered, his eyes filling with tears. She knew Marcus would try something. Ella plugged the drive into her laptop. The file opened instantly. It was a digital ghost, the full report, signed by Cora Thorne, detailing the exact failure that had killed her. Attached to it was an email thread between Marcus Vane and the project director. "Remove this report from the system by close of business," Marcus had written. "We do not have a structural problem. We have a perception problem. Fix it." It was the smoking gun. Ella closed the laptop. The coldness she had felt since the crash had solidified into something else, a diamond-hard resolve. She looked at Caleb. "I'm going back to Boston," she said. "You can't go alone," Caleb replied. "He'll have you intercepted before you reach the city limits." "I'm not going as Eleanor Sterling, the heiress," she said, her voice flat and dangerous. "I'm going as the chairperson of the board. I'm calling an emergency meeting for Thursday, and you're coming with me." Caleb looked at her, then at the list of names on the table. He looked at the daughter who had finally grown into her father's shadow and moved beyond it. "I've waited 9 years to wear a suit again," Caleb said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I think I can manage one more day." Upstairs, Maisie patted down in her pajamas, asking for a story. Ella watched. Caleb scooped the child up, the master of Oakhaven and the ghost of Boston finally merging into one man. The truth behind the scaffolding was out, and by the time the sun rose on Thursday, the Sterling Global Tower would realize that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a billionaire's secret. It was a daughter with nothing left to lose. The transition from the rustic, wood-scented air of Oakhaven to the sterile, pressurized atmosphere of the Sterling Global Tower was like surfacing from deep water into a frozen lake. Eleanor Sterling sat in the back of a nondescript black sedan, not a Range Rover, not anything that could be traced back to the company fleet. Beside her sat Caleb Thorne. Caleb was no longer the man in the faded flannel. He wore a charcoal gray, 3-piece suit that had been stored in a vacuum-sealed bag in the back of his closet for 9 years. It fit him with a precision that was terrifying. His hair was cropped short, his jaw clean-shaven, and his eyes had regained that predatory, analytical stillness that had once earned him the nickname, the architect, in the halls of the Supreme Court. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like an antique but contained a digital arsenal capable of toppling an empire. "You're quiet," Caleb said, his voice a low vibration in the moving car. "I'm realizing that for 27 years, I lived in a house built of glass." Ella replied, staring out at the Boston skyline. "I thought I was the heir to a legacy. I didn't realize I was the beneficiary of a crime scene. Arthur loved you, Ella. That was his one true thing. But love in the hands of a man like your father is a heavy, dangerous gift. He tried to shield you from the sun, and all he did was leave you in the dark. They pulled into the underground garage of the tower at 8:45 a.m. The security guards, trained to recognize the chairperson's face, snapped to attention. They didn't question the man beside her. There was something about Caleb's carriage that suggested he belonged exactly where he was, perhaps even more so than the people who worked there daily. They took the private express elevator. Most of the executive offices were on the 40th and 41st floors, but the 38th floor was different. It was the sanctum, the floor where the great boardroom sat, a circular chamber of mahogany and obsidian glass. It was where the most consequential decisions in the company's history had been made, and today, it would be where the company was unmade. When the doors opened, the air was cold. The silence was punctuated only by the soft footfalls of assistants who looked like they had been bred for discretion. Miss Sterling, a young man in a slim-fit suit, stammered, stepping forward. Mr. Vane wasn't expecting you until. Mr. Vane is an employee of this company, not the owner, Ella said, not breaking her stride. Is the board assembled? Yes, ma'am. They were just beginning the preliminary briefing on the merger. Perfect. Ella pushed open the heavy double doors of the boardroom. The room was a theater of power. A massive, circular table of polished black stone dominated the space. Seated around it were 9 members of the board, the silent 11 minus 2, who had already retired. At the head of the table, framed by the panoramic view of the Atlantic, sat Marcus Vane. He looked every bit the modern Titan. His silver-flecked hair was perfectly coiffed, his smile a masterpiece of practiced warmth. He was mid-sentence, gesturing toward a digital map of the proposed merger. The room went dead silent as Ella walked in. Marcus's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. He looked at Ella, then his gaze shifted to the man at her side. For a fraction of a second, so brief most would have missed it, Marcus Vane's face went bone white. He recognized the ghost. Ella, Marcus said, his voice regaining its silkiness. What a wonderful surprise. We were under the impression you were still recovering in the countryside, and I see you've brought a guest. A very old friend. This is not a social call, Marcus, Ella said. She walked to the opposite end of the table, facing him. Caleb remained standing behind her, a silent, looming shadow. I've called this emergency session under Article 4, Section 2 of the bylaws. I am assuming the floor. Ella, darling, this is a scheduled briefing for a multi-billion-dollar merger, said Julian Croft, a board member who had been a close friend of Arthur's for 30 years. Surely whatever you have can wait until the afternoon session. It cannot, Ella said. She nodded to Caleb. Caleb stepped forward and opened his briefcase. He didn't use the company's internal network. He produced a dedicated, encrypted hub and plugged it into the room's central console. The massive LED screens on the walls flickered, then displayed a single image, a handwritten letter on cream-colored stationery. Before we discuss the future of Sterling Global, Ella said, her voice echoing, in the hallowed chamber, we need to discuss its foundation. This is a letter, written by my father, Arthur Sterling, 10 days before his death. Marcus stood up. This is highly irregular. Arthur was in a fragile state at the end. Anything he wrote under that kind of duress is legally. Sit down, Marcus, Caleb Thorne said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, delivered with the weight of a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. You haven't been authorized to speak. The board members shifted uncomfortably. They looked at Caleb, then at the screen. Ella began to read. She didn't read the whole letter. She read the parts that mattered. She read the confession of the Valeri's project. She read the description of how the scaffolding report had been suppressed to protect the IPO. As she spoke, the screens began to scroll through the evidence. The original report signed by Cora Thorne, the rejection field marked with Marcus Vane's digital signature, and the email thread Caleb had recovered. In 2017, Ella continued, her voice gaining strength. This company allowed 3 people to die so that a stock price wouldn't drop. My father was a part of That's silence. But Marcus Vane was the architect of it. This is a fabrication, Marcus shouted, his composure finally cracking. Thorne is a disgruntled ex-partner with a vendetta. He's been hiding in the woods for a decade, weaving a fantasy. Is the car inspection report a fantasy too? Ella asked. She tapped a button on the console. The screens changed. Now they showed a technical diagram of her Range Rover. High-resolution photos showed the loosened brake lines and the drained power steering reservoir. 4 days ago, someone tried to kill me on a deserted road in Vermont, Ella said, her eyes locked on Marcus. The only reason I'm standing here is because I crashed into a man who knew the truth. I had an independent team from Chicago, not our firm. Marcus, I know who you pay here. Inspect the vehicle. They found manual tampering. They also found a GPS tracker that was linked to a shell company funded by Sterling Global's discretionary security fund. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Julian Croft looked at the screen, then at Marcus. His hands were shaking. Marcus, is this true? It's a lie, Marcus hissed. She's trying to stage a coup because she can't handle the pressure of the merger. I'm not finished, Ella said. She looked at the faces around the table. My father didn't die of a heart attack. He was a week away from turning himself into the FBI. He had a meeting scheduled with the assistant U.S. attorney. On the morning of that meeting, his heart gave out. I've requested an exhumation and a secondary toxicology report, but I don't need to wait for the results to know what happened. I've already seen the security footage from his private study that was supposed to be deleted. Caleb found it on the backup server in the basement of the Oak Haven barn, a server my father moved out of this building years ago. The screen showed a grainy video. It was Arthur's study. A man was seen entering, a man in a medical uniform. He wasn't the family doctor. He was a contractor Ella recognized from Marcus's personal security detail. The man replaced Arthur's nitroglycerin bottle with a different one. The board members looked away, some of them visibly nauseated. I have 3 motions for this board, Ella said, her voice cold as the Atlantic. First, the immediate termination and removal of Marcus Vane as managing director, pending criminal charges. Second, the resignation of the 2 board members, Julian Croft and Sarah Benning, who appear on my father's list as having received direct payments from the Valeri's Hush Fund. Third, the full disclosure of all Valeri's documents to the Department of Justice. You'll destroy the company, Sarah Benning whispered, her face ashen. The stock will be worthless by noon. Then let it burn, Ella said. I would rather be the woman who destroyed a corrupt empire than the one who sat on a throne made of lies. Marcus Vane looked around the room. He looked for an ally, a friend, a person he had bought, but he saw only a group of people who realized the ship was sinking and were looking for a lifeboat. You think you've won, Ella? Marcus said, his voice low and jagged. You think you can just walk in here and take it all? You're just like him. You're a Sterling. You're built on the same blood. No, Ella said. I'm my mother's daughter. And she didn't believe in silence. The door to the boardroom opened. This time, it wasn't an assistant. It was 4 men in dark windbreakers with letters across the back that made everyone in the room hold their breath. FBI. Behind them was a woman in a sharp suit, the assistant U.S. attorney her father had never lived to meet. Marcus Vane, she said, holding up a warrant. You are under arrest for the murders of Cora Thorne, Arthur Sterling, and the attempted murder of Eleanor Sterling, along with multiple counts of securities fraud and racketeering. Marcus didn't fight. He didn't even look surprised. He looked at Caleb Thorne. You should have stayed in the woods, Caleb. I stayed in the woods to build something that would last, Caleb said, his voice steady, and I stayed there to wait for her. As the agents led Marcus out in handcuffs, the rest of the board sat in stunned silence. Ella didn't look at them. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. For the first time in a year, the air didn't feel like poison. Caleb walked up beside her. He didn't say anything, but he placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her in a way that wasn't professional, a way that wasn't about the case. Is it over? She asked. No, Caleb said. Now comes the hard part. Now you have to decide what Sterling Global becomes when the glass is gone. I know what it becomes, Ella said. She looked at him, her eyes bright with a new kind of fire. It becomes the foundation for something better. But first, I'm going back to Oakhaven. I think I owe a little girl a story. They walked out of the boardroom, leaving the 38th floor behind. The reckoning was over, but the rebuilding had just begun. And as the elevator descended, Eleanor Sterling felt the weight of her father's legacy finally lift, replaced by the strength of a man who had waited 9 years to help her find the light. The storm that followed the reckoning on the 38th floor did not break with a thunderclap. It broke with a relentless, freezing rain of litigation, media scrutiny, and the slow, agonizing dismantling of a multi-billion-dollar lie. For 3 weeks, Eleanor Sterling did not sleep for more than 4 hours at a time. She traded her tailored wool coats for utilitarian blazers and her obsidian glass office for a war room in a nondescript law firm in Chicago. She had refused to use Sterling Global's internal counsel, knowing that even after the arrests, the rot might still linger in the shadows of the legal department. The story moved through the world like a tidal wave. It led on the Wall Street Journal, then Bloomberg, then the national wires. By the second week, the Sterling scandal was the defining corporate tragedy of the decade. Marcus Vane was indicted federally on charges of obstruction of justice, document fraud, racketeering, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. The investigation into Arthur Sterling's death had been formally reopened, and the toxicology report confirmed what the grainy video had suggested: a lethal, concentrated dose of nitroglycerin that had been swapped into his heart medication, designed to trigger a massive, natural cardiac arrest under the stress of his planned confession. Ella spent 17 hours a day submerged in the wreckage. She didn't hide behind a press secretary. She didn't issue hollow, corporate-speak apologies. Instead, she traveled. She flew to 4 states in 3 weeks to meet personally with the 9 families on her father's list, the families of the laborers who had been injured or killed at the Valeri site, and the relatives of those who had been paid to disappear. She sat in cramped living rooms in Springfield and modest kitchens in Ohio. She sat through their anger, their tears, and their decades-old grief. She did not interrupt. She did not offer a settlement figure until she had looked every person in the eye and said, "I am sorry. My father chose silence, and I am here to choose the truth." She declined every interview request from the major networks. She gave only one written statement to the press, 12 sentences long, signed with her own hand. It ended with the words, "A company is not a building or a stock price. It is a promise. We broke ours. Now we begin the work of earning back the right to exist." By the end of the 3rd week, the Silent 11 were either in custody or had reached plea deals. The board was reconstituted with independent directors who had no ties to the Sterling family or Marcus Vane. Ella made her final motion: the transfer of full operational control to this new board. She would retain only one position: chair of the Ethics Oversight Committee for the newly established Cora Thorne Foundation. The foundation was funded by the entirety of Marcus Vane's seized assets and a massive endowment from Ella's own inheritance. It was designed to provide lifelong medical care and educational scholarships for the families affected by corporate negligence. On a quiet Friday in late November, Ella finally walked out of the Chicago law firm. Her assistant, a woman who had stayed with her through the fire, asked, "Where to now, Miss Sterling? The Boston office is waiting for your briefing on the restructuring." Ella looked at the gray sky, the same color as the Vermont mist. "I'm not going to Boston," she said. "I'm going home." She didn't take the company jet. She didn't even take a car she owned. She rented an old, gray Subaru in Burlington, wanting something that didn't scream of the life she was leaving behind. The drive into the valley was different this time. The trees were bare, their branches like iron lace against the cold horizon. The air was sharp with the scent of coming snow. When she turned down the gravel drive in Oakhaven, the moss-green Ford was parked in its usual spot. The barn door was closed, but a steady curl of smoke rose from the chimney. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. The Silence of the Woods was no longer predatory. It was a welcome, heavy embrace. She walked to the barn and pushed open the heavy sliding door. The scent hit her first: walnut oil, beeswax, and the warm, golden heart of the workshop. Caleb was there, but he wasn't at his workbench. He was standing by the wood stove, holding a cup of tea. He looked up when she entered. He didn't look surprised. He looked as if he had been counting the minutes since she left. The 38th floor. "You're late," he said softly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I had to see 9 families," Ella said, her voice tired but steady. "And I had to sell an apartment on Beacon Hill." Caleb set his mug down. He walked toward her, and for the first time, he didn't look like the architect or the grieving widower. He just looked like a man who had finally finished a very long journey. "I heard about the foundation," he said. Cora would have liked the name. She always hated being called an architect. She thought builder was a more honest word. "I'm not a builder, Caleb," Ella said, looking around the workshop. "I'm just someone who stopped the wrecking ball. Sometimes that's the first step to building something new." A door upstairs creaked open. Maisie patted down the stairs in woolen socks, clutching a new drawing. When she saw Ella, she froze. Then her face erupted into a bright, gap-toothed grin. She didn't hesitate. She ran across the wood shavings and threw her arms around Ella's legs. Ella, who had spent her life navigating the cold intricacies of high finance, felt something in her chest finally, irrevocably thaw. She rested her hand on the top of Maisie's head. The gesture was clumsy, unpracticed, but it was real. "She missed you," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "I missed her too," Ella whispered. That evening, they sat in the kitchen of the barn. Marjorie had brought over a loaf of bread and a pot of stew, winking at Caleb on her way out and receiving nothing but a huff of mock annoyance in return. They ate by the light of the wood stove, the shadows dancing on the timber walls. After Maisie fell asleep on the sofa, Ella and Caleb went out onto the porch. The mist was settling into the valley, turning the world into a sea of silver. "Have you ever thought about going back?" Ella asked, looking toward the horizon, where she knew the lights of Boston were a faint, distant glow. "The firm in Chicago. They'd give you anything to have you as a consultant." Caleb took a long pull of the cold air. "I spent 12 years building things that were meant to be hidden. I spent 9 years waiting to deliver a letter. I think I've done enough talking for one lifetime." He turned to her. "What about you? You're the most famous CEO in the country right now. You could run for office. You could start a new empire." "I'm done with empires," Ella said. "I kept a small office in Boston for the foundation oversight, 2 days a month. The rest of the time." She looked at the clearing beside the workshop, a half-acre of sumac and old fencing. "I've been thinking about a project." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "A project?" "I'm not good with a hammer," she admitted, "but I'm very good at project management. I think this workshop needs a second floor, a place for Maisie to draw, a place with tall windows that look into the trees." Caleb looked at the lot, then back at her. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a foundation being poured. "It would take a lot of work," Caleb said, "and someone willing to be here when the framing goes up." "I'm willing," Ella said. Caleb reached out. He didn't take her hand, not yet. He just brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear with the back of his knuckle. It was a brief, light touch, but it held the weight of a promise kept and a new one made. "Then I guess we'd better get started," he said. 6 months later, the Vermont spring arrived with a riot of green and the smell of damp earth. The new wing of the workshop was framed up, its tall windows catching the afternoon sun. The siding was on, and the roof was set to be finished by midsummer. Marcus Vane had been sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The fake doctor, who had swapped the medication, had taken a plea deal, testifying to the systematic way Marcus had orchestrated the deaths. The sterling global stock had plummeted, then stabilized under the new, transparent leadership. The Clean Heart Project, the geothermal complex, had been sold to a public utility with the stipulation that the site be turned into a memorial park for the victims of the Valeri's project. On a Saturday afternoon in May, The three of them were painting the new workshop. Door. Caleb was on a ladder, doing the top panels with the same meticulous care he gave to his furniture. Maisie was crouched at the bottom, her face smudged with Oakhaven green paint, working with a small brush. Ella, wearing a pair of jeans and one of Caleb's old flannel shirts that was 3 sizes too big, was working the middle. She looked up and caught Caleb watching her. He didn't look away. He smiled, the first real, unburdened smile she had seen on him. Maisie looked up, her brush dripping. Ella, are you going to stay forever? Like, even when I'm big? The question hung in the warm air, mingling with the scent of pine and fresh paint. Ella looked at the child, then up at the man on the ladder. She thought about the Sterling Global Tower, the Beacon Hill apartment, and the glass house she had once lived in. None of it felt like it belonged to her anymore. I'm thinking about it, Ella said, her voice clear and bright. Caleb climbed down the ladder slowly. He set the brush on a tray and walked over to her. He looked at Maisie. Sweetheart, why don't you go find Marjorie? I think she has some lemonade waiting on the porch. Maisie didn't need to be told twice. She dropped her brush and ran across the yard, her laughter echoing through the trees. Caleb turned to Ella. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his Winter Lake eyes. You don't have to promise a child something you haven't promised yourself, he said softly. I'm promising both, Ella said. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was calloused, his grip steady, the hand of a man who built things to last. He pulled her slightly closer, and she didn't pull back. In the late afternoon light, with the moss-green Ford parked under the budding maple tree and the sound of the river rushing in the distance, the daughter of a silent titan and the counselor who had carried his burden found that they weren't just survivors anymore. They were builders. And as the sun dipped below the green mountains, casting a warm, golden glow over the new workshop, Eleanor Sterling realized that her father had been right about one thing. The letter had been a map. It just hadn't been a map to a treasure or a legacy. It had been a map to this, to a place where the truth didn't just set you free, it gave you a place to call home. Marjorie stood on the porch, drying her hands on her apron, watching the two of them in the yard. She looked up at the empty sky and whispered something only she could hear, a message to a friend who had been gone for 9 years. The promise was kept. The right person had arrived. And in the heart of Oakhaven, a new foundation had finally been laid, one that no storm, no matter how cold, would ever be able to shake.